At 07:10 hours on the morning of June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder pressed himself against the clay-covered base of a 100-foot cliff at Pointe du Hoc, Normandy, watching his Rangers die. Machine gun fire raked across the narrow beach from German positions above. Mortar shells exploded in the surf behind him. Bodies floated in the cold water. 2 landing craft were already sunk. The entire mission was collapsing before the men even touched the cliff face. Rudder was 34 years old, a former high school football coach from Texas who'd been teaching teenagers how to block and tackle 3 years earlier. Now he commanded 225 elite soldiers tasked with what one naval officer had called an impossible mission: scale vertical cliffs under enemy fire, destroy 6 German 155mm guns that could devastate the invasion beaches. Do it in 30 minutes. The officer who said it couldn't be done had been specific in his assessment. 3 old women with brooms could keep the Rangers from climbing those cliffs. Rudder stood at the base of those cliffs now, soaked through, exhausted from an hour-long boat ride through rough seas and 40 minutes late. The delay had cost them everything. The backup force, Companies A and B of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, plus the entire 5th Ranger Battalion, over 500 men who were supposed to follow Rudder's assault, had already diverted to Omaha Beach according to the contingency plan. Rudder and his 3 companies, Companies D, E, and F, were alone. No reinforcements were coming. The Germans had 40 minutes to reoccupy their positions after the naval bombardment ended. They were waiting. The cliffs towered above the Rangers. 100 feet of near-vertical chalk and clay, slick with moisture from the morning mist. At the top sat concrete bunkers with 6-foot-thick walls, machine gun positions with interlocking fields of fire, artillery observation posts that could direct German guns onto every square meter of Omaha and Utah beaches. And somewhere up there, protected by those fortifications, sat 6 French-made GPF 155mm artillery pieces that could hit targets 12 miles away. Those guns could reach every ship in the invasion fleet. They could obliterate the landing beaches. They could kill thousands of American soldiers before the men even got off the boats. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mission to destroy those guns had been assigned to Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion in January 1944. When Lieutenant General Omar Bradley had first briefed Rudder on the objective, the Ranger officer couldn't believe what he was hearing. Bradley wanted Rudder to land his men on a narrow beach at the base of the cliffs during low tide, scale the vertical face using ropes and ladders while German defenders shot down at them and threw grenades, reach the top, overrun the fortified positions, destroy the guns, and establish a defensive perimeter, all before dawn on D-Day, all before the main invasion force hit Omaha Beach 3 miles to the east. Rudder had studied the aerial photographs. He'd examined the plaster models of Pointe du Hoc that Allied intelligence had constructed. He'd looked at those cliffs from every angle the reconnaissance aircraft could photograph. The conclusion was unavoidable. This mission would kill most of his men. But if the Rangers didn't take out those guns, the Germans would kill thousands of American soldiers on the beaches. The arithmetic was brutal but clear. Risk 225 Rangers to save thousands of infantrymen. Sacrifice the few to save the many. The Rangers had trained for this moment since April 1943, when the 2nd Ranger Battalion was activated at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Rudder had been selected to command them on June 30th, 1943. He'd been a major then, promoted to lieutenant colonel after taking command. His background seemed an odd fit for leading elite commandos. He'd graduated from Texas A&M University in 1932 with a degree in industrial education. He'd taught school, he'd coached football, he'd been commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the Army Reserve, but spent his time teaching teenagers, not soldiers. When he was called to active duty in June 1941, Rudder was 31 years old with no combat experience, no special operations training, no background in amphibious warfare. But he understood how to train men. He understood discipline. He understood that soldiers fought for each other more than they fought for causes. He built the 2nd Ranger Battalion through relentless training and leading by example. He never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. During cliff-climbing practice on the coast of England, Rudder climbed first. During forced marches, he marched at the front. During night navigation exercises, he navigated with them. The Rangers trained with British commandos who had experience conducting raids on the French coast. They learned cliff assault techniques on the cliffs of the Isle of Wight. They practiced with different types of ropes and ladders. They experimented with rocket-fired grappling hooks that could shoot rope lines to the top of cliffs. They trained in rough seas, in darkness, in rain. They trained until the movements became automatic. Grab the rope, lock your legs around it, climb hand over hand, don't look down. Keep climbing until you reach the top or until you're dead. By May 1944, Rudder's Rangers were ready. They knew their mission, they knew their objective, they knew most of them probably wouldn't survive. On June 1st, they boarded ships at Weymouth Harbour in southern England. Companies D, E, and F boarded British landing craft assault vessels, LCAs, designed to carry 22 men each. The Rangers loaded their equipment: M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, Bangalore torpedoes, thermite grenades designed to destroy artillery pieces by melting their firing mechanisms, rocket launchers that would fire the grappling hooks, extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade mounted on DUKBUs, amphibious trucks that would carry 100-foot ladders to the cliff base. The plan was precise. Force A, consisting of Companies D, E, and F, would land directly below Pointe du Hoc at 0630 hours on June 6th. Companies E and F would land on the eastern side of the point. Company D would land on the west. They'd scale the cliffs simultaneously from both sides using rocket-fired ropes and the extension ladders. Once on top, they'd assault the gun positions, destroy the artillery pieces with thermite grenades, and establish a defensive perimeter along the coastal road that connected the villages of Grand Camp and Vieilleville-sur-Mer. They'd hold that position until reinforcements arrived from Omaha Beach. Force C, consisting of Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers, plus the entire 5th Ranger Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, would wait offshore for 30 minutes. If Rudder succeeded in scaling the cliffs and securing the position, he'd fire flares to signal Schneider's force to follow him ashore at Pointe du Hoc. If the flares didn't appear by 07 hours, that meant Rudder's assault had failed. Schneider would divert to Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach and attack from there, fighting his way west along the coast to relieve whatever Rangers might still be alive at the point. The contingency plan made tactical sense. If Rudder couldn't scale the cliffs, there was no point in sending 500 more men to die on that beach. Better to land at Omaha, where they might actually get inland. But the plan assumed everything would work perfectly on Rudder's assault. It assumed the landing craft would arrive on time. It assumed the naval bombardment would suppress the German defenders. It assumed the rocket-fired grappling hooks would work. It assumed a lot of things that combat tends to destroy in the first 5 minutes. On June 5th, the invasion was postponed one day due to weather. The Rangers stayed on their ships, cramped in the holds, trying to sleep, trying not to think about the cliffs. On the evening of June the 5th, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower visited the Rangers at their staging area. He moved among the men, shaking hands, asking where they were from. When he reached Rudder, Eisenhower looked at him seriously and said the fate of the invasion might depend on what happened at Pointe du Hoc. The Rangers had to succeed. The guns had to be destroyed. There was no backup plan. Eisenhower's assessment was accurate. Allied intelligence had confirmed that the Germans had positioned 6 155mm artillery pieces at Pointe du Hoc. These weren't ordinary field guns. They were French-made Canon de 155 Grande Puissance Filou model 1917 guns, captured after France fell in 1940. Each gun could fire a 95-pound high-explosive shell over 12 miles. The guns at Pointe du Hoc had overlapping fields of fire that covered both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. They could hit any ship in the invasion fleet. They could crater the landing beaches with precision fire. The German defenders at Pointe du Hoc came from the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260, Heereskustenartillerie, Abteilung 1260. They were commanded by Oberleutnant Frido Eberling. His battery was part of the Atlantic Wall, the extensive fortification system that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been strengthening since late 1943. Rommel had learned in North Africa what Allied air power and naval gunfire could do. He knew the Allies would bombard the French coast before landing. So he designed his defenses to survive bombardment. At Pointe du Hoc, the Germans had constructed 6 concrete casemates to house the artillery pieces. These weren't simple bunkers. They were massive, reinforced concrete structures with walls up to 6 feet thick. The casemates were positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun positions covered the beach approaches. Observation posts gave the Germans perfect visibility over the landing beaches miles away. The fortifications were connected by a network of trenches and tunnels that allowed defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to fire. The entire complex was studded with mines, barbed wire, and obstacles designed to slow any assault. The Allies had tried to destroy these fortifications before D-Day. Beginning in late April, Allied bombers had pounded Pointe du Hoc repeatedly. On April the 25th, bombers hit the position. On May 21st and 22nd, more strikes. On June 4th and 5th, heavy bombardment. Hundreds of tons of explosives fell on that narrow promontory. The bombing cratered the ground, destroyed some of the surface structures, and forced the Germans to take shelter in their deep bunkers and tunnels. But the bombs didn't destroy the casemates. They didn't knock out the guns. On the morning of June 6th, at 0550 hours, naval bombardment began. The battleship USS Texas opened fire with her 14-inch guns. Each shell weighed was 1,400 pounds. The Texas fired from 7,000 yards offshore, lobbing shells in high arcs that fell on Pointe du Hoc like meteors. The destroyers USS Satterlee and HMS Talibont added their 5-inch guns to the barrage. For 40 minutes, the warships pounded the clifftop. The noise was overwhelming. The flashes lit up the pre-dawn darkness. Smoke and dust rose hundreds of feet into the air. From the landing craft approaching the beach, the Rangers watched the bombardment and felt hope. Nothing could survive that. The Germans would be dead or stunned. The fortifications would be rubble. The Rangers would climb the cliffs against minimal resistance. That's what the plan said. That's what the briefings promised. But when the naval gunfire lifted at 0630, the Germans emerged from their bunkers and reoccupied their positions. The concrete casemates had protected them. The deep tunnels had kept them safe. They were alive, alert, and waiting. At 0445, Rudder's Rangers had boarded their landing craft and started the journey to shore. Each LCA carried 22 men packed shoulder to shoulder. The boats rode low in the choppy water. Waves broke over the sides. Men bailed constantly to keep the craft from swamping. The channel was rough. The boats pitched and rolled. Rangers became seasick, vomiting into the bilges, trying to keep their equipment dry. The ride was supposed to take 1 hour. It took longer. The lead boat, carrying Rudder, veered off course in the darkness and smoke. The navigator aboard the landing craft became disoriented. He couldn't see the landmarks he'd memorized from the aerial photographs. The smoke from the naval bombardment obscured the coastline. When the boats emerged from the smoke and the navigator finally got his bearings, he realized his error. They were 3 miles east of Pointe du Hoc, heading straight for the cliffs near the village of Maisie. If they'd landed there, the Rangers would have assaulted the wrong target entirely. Rudder spotted the mistake immediately. He knew the coastline from studying the reconnaissance photos. He knew the shape of Pointe du Hoc, the distinctive promontory jutting into the channel. The cliffs ahead weren't right. The angles were wrong. Rudder shouted orders to the coxswain. "Turn west. Head along the coast. Find Pointe du Hoc." The landing craft turned parallel to the shore and started moving west at top speed. The other boats followed. For 35 minutes, the landing craft ran along the French coast in full view of German positions on shore. Machine guns opened fire. 20mm anti-aircraft guns fired at the boats. Shells kicked up spray around the craft. One supply DUKWU, carrying ammunition and equipment, took a direct hit and sank. Only one Ranger survived. Another DUKW carrying one of the extension ladders was destroyed by 20mm fire. The ladder, one of only 4 they had, went to the bottom. By the time Rudder's force finally reached Pointe du Hoc, it was 0710 hours, 40 minutes late. The naval bombardment had ended at 0630. For 40 minutes, the German defenders had been reoccupying their positions, undisturbed. They'd moved back into their machine gun nests. They'd repositioned their mortars. They'd brought up grenades and ammunition. They were ready, and they'd been watching the landing. Craft run along the coast for the past 35 minutes. They knew exactly where the Americans were landing. The delay had another consequence. At 0700 hours, precisely 30 minutes after Rudder's force was supposed to land, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider had been watching for flares from the cliff top. No flares appeared. According to the plan, that meant Rudder's assault had failed. Schneider ordered his 500-man force to divert to Omaha Beach. Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers and the entire 5th Ranger Battalion turned east and headed for Dog Green sector. Rudder and his 225 men were alone. The 10 remaining landing craft approached the beach at 0710. German fire intensified. Machine guns traversed across the approaching boats. Mortars dropped shells into the water. The Rangers could see muzzle flashes from the cliff top. They could hear the crack of bullets passing overhead. They could see the tracers arcing down toward them. One landing craft took a direct mortar hit and began taking on water. The men bailed frantically to keep it afloat. Rudder's LCA, number 888, hit the beach first. The ramp splashed down into knee-deep water. Machine gun fire erupted from above. Rudder ran down the ramp into the cold water and headed for the cliff base. His executive officer, Major Cleveland Lytle, had been relieved of command just before the mission after becoming vocal during a briefing about intelligence reports that the guns had been removed. Lytle, influenced by alcohol, had argued the assault would be unnecessary and suicidal. Rudder had relieved him on the spot. A commander who didn't believe in the mission couldn't lead men to accomplish it. The Rangers followed Rudder across the narrow beach. The beach was only 30 yards wide at low tide, 30 yards of exposed ground between the water and the cliff base. German fire swept across every inch of it. Rangers ran. Some fell immediately, shot before they reached the cliff. Others made it to the base and pressed themselves against the clay wall. The cliff face provided some shelter from direct fire, but the Germans adapted quickly. They threw potato masher grenades over the edge. The grenades tumbled down the cliff face and exploded among the Rangers below. Men from E Company and F Company landed on the eastern side of the point. Company D landed to the west. All 3 companies came under immediate fire. Lieutenant James Eichner, commanding a platoon in E Company, was the last man off his landing craft. He ran down the ramp into water up to his knees and headed across the beach. Bullets snapped past him. Men around him were hit. Bodies fell into the water. Eichner reached the cliff base and looked up. 100 feet of vertical clay, machine gun fire from above, grenades dropping down, and they had to climb. The Rangers immediately began setting up the rocket launchers. These were simple tubes that fired projectiles, attached to lengths of rope. The rockets were designed to arch over the cliff top, trailing rope behind them. When the rocket reached the top, a grappling hook would catch on something, rocks, obstacles, fortifications, and the rope would hang down the cliff face. Rangers could then climb the rope using their hands and legs, pulling themselves up yard by yard until they reached the top. The first rockets fired. The whoosh of the projectile, the rope uncoiling as it flew upward, the thunk as the grappling hook hit something at the top. The Rangers pulled on the ropes to test them. Some held. Some pulled free immediately. The Germans had seen the rocket launchers. They knew what was coming. German soldiers appeared at the cliff edge and began cutting ropes before the Rangers could climb them. Other Germans threw grenades down at the men setting up the launchers. The destroyer USS Satterlee, stationed close to shore to provide fire support, saw the Germans at the cliff edge. The destroyer's 5-inch guns opened fire. High explosive shells screamed over the beach and detonated on the cliff top. Concrete and rock exploded. German soldiers were thrown back from the edge or blown apart. The naval gunfire suppressed the German defenders momentarily. More rockets fired, more ropes went up. This time, more of them held. Rangers began climbing. The wet ropes were slippery. The clay cliff face offered no handholds or footholds. Men had to pull themselves up, using only arm strength, their legs wrapped around the rope, inching upward. Each man carried 60 pounds of equipment, rifles slung across backs, ammunition, grenades, Bangalore torpedoes. The weight made a climbing exhausting. Arms burned, hands cramped. But they climbed because stopping meant falling and falling meant dying. German machine gun fire swept across the cliff face. Bullets hit the clay around the climbing rangers, kicking up clouds of dust. Some rounds found their targets. Rangers were hit and fell, tumbling down the cliff to land broken on the beach below. Other rangers kept climbing. The men on the ropes became targets. The Germans focused their fire on anyone climbing. Machine gun bursts walked up the cliff face toward the climbers. Rangers at the base of the cliff fired back with Browning automatic rifles. The BR was a 20-pound automatic rifle that could fire 500 rounds per minute. Rangers spotted German soldiers at the cliff edge and opened fire, 20 or 30 round bursts. The heavy rifle bucked against their shoulders. Spent brass ejected and clattered onto the rocks. Germans fell back from the edge or dropped dead. The suppressing fire gave the climbers precious seconds to gain height. The DUKWs, carrying the extension ladders, tried to approach the beach. These were the 100-foot ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, mounted on the amphibious trucks. The plan called for the DUKWs to drive up to the cliff base and extend the ladders vertically, providing a faster way to reach the top than climbing ropes. But one DUKW had already been destroyed by 20mm fire during the approach. Another DUKW got stuck in a shell crater underwater and couldn't make it to the beach. Only 2 ladders reached the cliff. The first DUKW extended its ladder against the cliff face. Rangers started climbing immediately. The ladder was aluminum, designed for fighting fires, not for combat. It swayed under the weight of armed men climbing in full gear. The Germans saw the ladder and concentrated fire on it. Machine gun bullets pinged off the aluminum rungs. The ladder shook from the impacts. Rangers climbed anyway, hand over hand up the rungs, trying not to look down, trying not to think about the machine gun bullets cutting through the air inches away. One ranger reached the top of the ladder and pulled himself over the cliff edge into a German position. He killed 2 Germans with his rifle before a grenade killed him. Another ranger followed and made it into cover at the top. Then another. The ladder provided a conduit to the cliff top, but it was exposed. Anyone climbing it was visible to every German on that section of the cliff. The casualties were heavy, but the Rangers kept climbing because there was no other way up. By 0730, approximately 45 Rangers had reached the cliff top. Lieutenant Eichner used a signal lamp to flash a message to the ships offshore. Praise the Lord. The signal meant Rangers were on top of the cliff. The impossible mission was succeeding. Rudder climbed a rope to the top and established his command post in a shell crater near the cliff edge. Captain Walter Block, the battalion surgeon, climbed up and set up an aid station in a 2-room concrete emplacement. It was pitch black inside. Block worked by flashlight, treating wounded Rangers in one room while the dead were placed in the other. The scene at the top was chaos. The aerial and naval bombardment had turned Pointe du Hoc into a lunar landscape. Craters pocked the ground everywhere. Some craters were 15 feet deep, 30 feet across. The ground between craters was churned earth and broken concrete. The concrete casemates, the massive structures built to house the artillery pieces, were still standing, but damaged. Chunks of concrete had been blown off. Reinforcing steel rods were exposed. Smoke and dust hung in the air. Fires burned where explosives had ignited ammunition stores or fuel. And the guns weren't there. Rangers reached the first casemate and found it empty. Just a concrete shell with a massive opening where the gun should have been. They checked the second casemate. Empty. The third. Empty. All 6 casemates were vacant. Instead of 155mm artillery pieces, the Rangers found wooden telephone poles, painted and positioned, to look like gun barrels from the air. The Germans had removed the guns weeks earlier, probably in response to the repeated Allied bombing raids. They'd replaced them with decoys to fool reconnaissance aircraft. The primary mission, the reason 225 Rangers had risked everything to climb those cliffs, was based on intelligence that was weeks out of date. The guns were gone, but that didn't mean the mission was a failure. Those guns were somewhere nearby. The Germans hadn't abandoned 6 powerful artillery pieces. They'd moved them to protect them from bombing. The guns were still a threat, and the Rangers' mission was to destroy them, wherever they were. Rudder organized his men quickly. Some Rangers would hold the cliff top and defend against German counterattacks. Others would patrol inland to find the guns. Still others would establish roadblocks along the coastal highway to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Omaha Beach. The Rangers split into small groups and moved out through the cratered landscape. They advanced through the ruins of the fortifications, clearing trenches and bunkers, killing or capturing German soldiers who continued resisting. First Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn from Company D formed a two-man patrol and headed south toward the coastal road. They moved through hedgerows and shell craters, weapons ready, watching for German soldiers. They'd been moving for about 15 minutes when they stumbled into something unexpected. Tracks in the soft earth, deep ruts carved by heavy wheels. Artillery pieces leave distinctive tracks. These tracks were fresh, made within the past day or two. Lommel and Kuhn followed the tracks. The trail led south through an apple orchard, approximately 250 yards from the coastal highway. Lommel and Kuhn moved carefully, weapons at the ready. They crept through the trees and suddenly saw them. 5 of the 6 missing 155mm guns, lined up in a camouflaged position pointing toward Utah Beach. The guns were completely unguarded. No infantry protecting them, no artillery crew manning them. Just 5 massive artillery pieces sitting in an orchard, ready to fire, but temporarily abandoned. Lommel and Kuhn didn't hesitate. They moved quickly to the first gun. Lommel pulled thermite grenades from his gear. Thermite grenades burned at over 4,000 degrees, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to destroy a gun's firing mechanism permanently. Lommel pulled the pin on the first grenade and dropped it into the gun's recoil mechanism. The grenade ignited with a white-hot flame. Metal began melting immediately. The gun was ruined. Lommel and Kuhn moved to the second gun. Another thermite grenade, the third gun, the fourth, the fifth. Within minutes, all 5 artillery pieces were destroyed. Their firing mechanisms were molten slag. They would never fire again. The 2 Rangers then ran back to report to Rudder. They'd accomplished the primary mission. The guns that could have devastated the invasion beaches were destroyed. The 6th gun was never found. It may have been out for repairs as intelligence suggested or hidden elsewhere. But 5 out of 6 was enough. The threat to the beaches was eliminated. Lommel and Kuhn's action, and 2 men acting on initiative without direct orders, had achieved what the entire mission was designed to accomplish. But the Rangers' fight at Pointe du Hoc was far from over. By 0830, approximately 60 Rangers were on the cliff top. Another 65 were still climbing or pinned down on the beach. The rest were casualties. 15 men had been killed or wounded during the climb. More were hit by German fire after reaching the top. Rudder's force was already down to about 190 effectives out of 225. And the German counterattacks were just beginning. The German defenders at Pointe du Hoc came from multiple units. Elements of the 716th Infantry Division garrisoned the fortifications. Artillery crews from the coastal battery were scattered around the position. When the Rangers landed, many German soldiers had been caught in their bunkers by the naval bombardment or were in defensive positions along the cliff edge. But other German units were nearby. Stationed in the villages of Grand Camp and Crickville, when the commanders of those units received reports of American commandos on the cliffs, they immediately organized counterattacks. Throughout the rest of June the 6th, German infantry attempted to retake Pointe du Hoc. The attacks came in waves. Small groups of German soldiers would advance through the cratered landscape using shell holes for cover, firing machine guns and rifles, throwing grenades. The Rangers fought back from their positions in craters and ruined bunkers. The fighting was the close range, brutal. Men killed each other at distances, measured in yards. Grenades were thrown. Rifles fired at point-blank range. The Rangers held their ground. By late afternoon on June 6th, the Rangers had established a defensive perimeter roughly 300 yards inland from the cliff edge. They'd blocked the coastal highway between Grand Camp and Vierzich-sur-Mer, cutting off a critical German supply route. They'd destroyed the 5 artillery pieces that threatened the invasion beaches. They'd accomplished their mission, but they were isolated, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. German counterattacks intensified as darkness fell. The Germans wanted Pointe du Hoc back. They needed that high ground. They needed control of the coastal road. At 2300 hours on June 6th, the Germans launched the first of three major counterattacks. Infantry from the 914th Grenadier Regiment advanced through the darkness, probing for weak points in the Ranger defensive line. The Rangers fired back with everything they had: M1 Garand rifles, Browning automatic rifles, the few remaining grenades. They fought from shell craters and ruined bunkers, holding their positions against superior numbers. Throughout the night of June 6th and into June 7th, 23 Rangers from the 5th Ranger Battalion managed to reach Pointe du Hoc from Omaha Beach. They'd fought their way 7 kilometers through German positions, crossing enemy-held territory in darkness to reinforce Rudder's battered force. Every additional man mattered. The Rangers were down to critical ammunition levels. Medical supplies were exhausted. Food and water were running low. Captain Block treated wounded men with whatever he could scavenge from dead Germans and dead Rangers. The Germans launched their second major counterattack at 0300 hours on June 7th. This assault drove the Rangers back from their forward positions near the coastal road. Several men from Company E were killed or captured. Rangers from Company D didn't hear the order to withdraw and were cut off from the main defensive perimeter. Some made it back to friendly lines later. Others were forced to hide in hedgerows and ditches to avoid capture. The Rangers were being compressed back toward the cliff edge. By dawn, on June 7th, Rudder's force controlled only a small pocket of land directly adjacent to the cliffs. They'd lost their roadblock positions. They'd lost their forward observation posts, but they still held the high ground at Pointe du Hoc itself. And, more importantly, the guns were destroyed. The mission was accomplished, even if the men who'd accomplished it were dying. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Rudder was wounded twice during the fighting. Shrapnel tore into his leg on June 6th. He refused evacuation. On June 7th, he was hit again. Still, he refused to leave his men. He directed the defense from his command post crater, coordinating what little artillery support the destroyers offshore could provide. Rationing ammunition, organizing counterattacks when the Germans pressed too close. His presence held the unit together. The Rangers knew that if their commander was still fighting, they would fight too. By the morning of June 8th, only 90 Rangers were still combat effective. Out of 225 men who'd landed 2 days earlier, 77 were dead, 152 were wounded, 38 were missing. The casualty rate was over 70%. Companies D, E, and F had effectively ceased to exist as organized units. What remained was a collection of exhausted, wounded men holding a few hundred yards of cratered ground. At 11:30 hours on June 8th, relief finally arrived. Elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment broke through from Omaha Beach, accompanied by tanks from the 743rd Tank Battalion. The sound of American tank engines approaching from the east was the most beautiful sound the Rangers had ever heard. The tanks rolled up the coastal road, firing their 75mm guns at German positions. Infantry followed, clearing the hedgerows and villages the Germans had been using to stage their counterattacks. The siege of Pointe du Hoc was over. The Rangers had held for 2 days against overwhelming odds. They'd accomplished their mission despite casualties that would have broken most units. 13 Rangers received the Distinguished Service Cross for heroism at Pointe du Hoc. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. The citation recognized that the Rangers had seized and held vital terrain that protected the invasion beaches. During the most critical phase of the assault, Rudder survived the war. He commanded the 109th Infantry Regiment during the Battle of the Bulge. He ended the war as a full colonel. He was promoted to Brigadier General in the Army Reserve in 1954 and to Major General in 1957. After the war, he returned to Texas. He served as mayor of Brady, Texas. He was elected Texas Land Commissioner. In 1959, he became president of Texas A&M University, transforming it from a small military college into a major research university. Rudder died on March 23, 1970, at age 59. He's buried at the Texas State Cemetery in Austin. The memorial at Pointe du Hoc, erected by the French government and maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, stands on the clifftop where Rudder's Rangers fought. The granite pylon rises from a German concrete bunker. Tablets at its base are inscribed in French and English, honoring the 2nd Ranger Battalion. The battlefield remains largely as the Rangers left it. Craters pock the ground, concrete casemates still stand. Visitors can walk to the cliff edge and look down at the beach where 225 men landed under fire. The mission at Pointe du Hoc has become legendary in Army Ranger history. The motto, "Rangers lead the way," is directly connected to the actions at Normandy. What Rudder and his men accomplished on June 6, 1944, set the standard for special operations missions. They scaled impossible cliffs under enemy fire. They destroyed their objective despite terrible casualties. They held their position for 2 days without reinforcement. They refused to quit even when quitting would have been reasonable. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc proved that highly trained soldiers, properly led and committed to their mission, can accomplish objectives that seem impossible. 79 years later, their example still inspires. The cliffs are still there, the bunkers are still there, and the memory of what those Rangers accomplished will never fade. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.